You know that feeling when something's just off, when every instinct in your body is screaming that you should be afraid, but you can't quite put your finger on why. Well, that's exactly what I felt 3 months ago when I answered a knock at my door at 2 in the morning. What I found on the other side changed everything I thought I knew about the house I'd been living in for 6 years. This happened to me back in September, and honestly, I've been debating whether to share this story because it still gives me chills just thinking about it. But after everything that's happened since then, I think you guys need to hear this. Because what started as a simple midnight knock turned into something that made me question my own sanity and eventually forced me to move out of my apartment entirely. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened that night, step by step. And then I'll tell you about the discoveries I made afterward that completely shattered my understanding of what was really going on. Trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to understand why I haven't slept properly in months. Before I dive into the main event, let me paint you a picture of where I was living. I had this cozy one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old brick building in downtown Portland. It was one of those classic 1920s buildings with thick walls, creaky hardwood floors, and those old-fashioned radiators that would clank and hiss all winter long. The building had character, you know? It felt safe, familiar, like home. My apartment faced the street, and my bedroom window looked out over the main entrance below. I'd been living there for 6 years, and in all that time, I'd never had any problems. Sure, there were the usual city sounds, the occasional drunk person stumbling down the sidewalk, but nothing that ever made me feel unsafe. The building had a secure entry system, and you needed a key to get into the main lobby. So when I heard that knock on my door at 2 in the morning, my first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion. I was lying in bed, probably scrolling through my phone like I always did before falling asleep when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks, not frantic pounding, not the kind of desperate banging you'd expect from someone in trouble. Just 3 calm, measured knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The kind of knock you'd expect from a neighbor asking to borrow sugar, except it was 2 in the morning. I sat up in bed listening. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the building settling or someone in the hallway dropping something. But then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. Same rhythm, same intensity. Someone was definitely at my door. Now, I'm not the type of person who just opens their door in the middle of the night. I've watched enough horror movies to know that nothing good happens when you answer unexpected knocks after midnight. But I was curious. Who could possibly be at my door at this hour? Maybe it was my downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She was in her 70s and sometimes had health issues. Maybe she needed help with something. I got out of bed, threw on a robe, and walked to my front door. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of streetlights coming through my living room window. I approached the door quietly, trying not to make any noise. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see Mrs. Chen or maybe one of my other neighbors standing in the hallway. But there was nobody there. The hallway was completely empty. I could see the familiar beige carpet, the scuffed walls, the fluorescent light fixture that always flickered slightly. But no person, no one standing at my door, no one walking away down the hall, just an empty corridor. I stood there for a moment, staring through the peephole, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe whoever it was had already left. Maybe they'd knocked on the wrong door and realized their mistake. But the timing didn't make sense. I'd heard the knocks just seconds before I got to the door. There hadn't been enough time for someone to knock and then disappear completely. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for footsteps, for any sound that might indicate someone was still out there. But all I could hear was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Nothing else. After about 5 minutes of standing there like an idiot, I finally went back to bed. I convinced myself that I'd either imagined the whole thing or that someone had knocked on the wrong door and quickly realized their mistake. People do weird things when they're drunk or confused, right? Maybe someone had gotten off the elevator on the wrong floor. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The knocks had been so deliberate, so intentional. They didn't sound like the random knocking of someone who was lost or confused. They sounded like someone who knew exactly which door they were knocking on. I must have eventually fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is waking up to my alarm at 7 in the morning. The whole midnight knock thing felt like a weird dream, something my brain had cooked up in that hazy space between sleeping and waking. I got ready for work, grabbed my coffee, and headed out the door. But as I was walking down the hallway toward the elevator, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, right in front of my door, was a small piece of paper. It was folded in half and had been slipped under my door at some point during the night. I must have walked right over it when I left my apartment. I picked up the paper and unfolded it. Inside, written in pencil in shaky handwriting, was a single sentence. "I know you're in there." My hands started shaking as I read those words over and over again. Someone had been at my door in the middle of the night, someone who knew I was home, someone who had taken the time to write me a note and slip it under my door. This wasn't some random drunk person who'd gotten confused about which apartment was theirs. This was deliberate. This was targeted. I looked up and down the hallway, half expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty except for the usual sounds of people getting ready for work. I could hear Mrs. Chen's television through her door, the sound of someone taking a shower from the apartment across the hall. Normal morning sounds, but nothing felt normal anymore. I stuffed the note into my pocket and tried to go about my day, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear those 3 knocks echoing in my head. Knock, knock, knock. And that message, "I know you're in there," kept playing on repeat in my mind. Who had written it? How had they gotten into the building? And most importantly, what did they want from me? I spent my entire workday trying to come up with rational explanations. Maybe it was a prank from one of my neighbors. Maybe it was someone who had the wrong apartment number. Maybe it was just some random person who had somehow gotten into the building and was messing with people. But none of these explanations felt right. When I got home from work that evening, I did something I'd never done before in 6 years of living in that building. I called the property management company and asked if they'd had any reports of unauthorized people in the building. The woman on the phone seemed confused by my question. "No, we haven't had any security issues," she said. "Is there a specific problem you're concerned about?" I told her about the midnight knock and the note, and she assured me that she'd look into it. She also reminded me that the building had security cameras in the lobby and hallways, and that she could check the footage if I was really concerned. That should have made me feel better, but somehow it didn't. If there were cameras in the hallways, then whoever had knocked on my door and left that note should have been caught on video. Unless they knew exactly where the cameras were and how to avoid them. That night I barely slept. Every little sound in the building made me jump. The radiator clanking, footsteps in the hallway above me, even the elevator dinging on different floors. I kept getting up to check the peephole, but the hallway was always empty. Just that same flickering fluorescent light casting shadows on the beige carpet. The next morning, I called the property management company back. The woman I'd spoken to the day before told me she'd reviewed the security footage from the night in question. What she said next made my stomach drop. "That's really strange," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I can see you getting up and going to your door around 2 in the morning, but I don't see anyone in the hallway before or after that time. Are you sure someone knocked?" I told her I was absolutely sure. I described the 3 knocks, the timing, everything. She said she'd review the footage again and get back to me, but I could tell from her tone that she thought I was either lying or losing my mind. I hung up the phone feeling even more unsettled than before. If there was no one on the security footage, then how had someone knocked on my door? How had they left that note? It didn't make sense. Unless the cameras had blind spots, or unless someone knew exactly how to avoid them. That afternoon, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I walked around the building looking for any possible way someone could have gotten to my floor without being seen by the cameras. The building was old, but it seemed pretty secure. There was only one entrance, and it required a key card to get in. The stairwells were covered by cameras, and so were all the hallways. But then I remembered something. The building had a fire escape that ran along the backside. It was one of those old metal structures that zigzagged up the exterior wall. I'd never paid much attention to it before, but now I wondered if someone could have climbed up to the 3rd floor and somehow gotten into the building through a window or door. I walked around to the back of the building and looked up at the fire escape. It was definitely accessible from the ground level, and it led right past several windows on each floor. But all the windows I could see were closed, and most of them looked like they hadn't been opened in years. Still, the possibility nagged at me. What if someone had used the fire escape to get to my floor? What if they'd found a way to get into the building without being seen by the cameras? I spent the rest of the week in a state of constant anxiety. Every night I'd lie in bed listening for sounds in the hallway. I'd get up multiple times to check the peephole, expecting to see someone standing there, but nothing happened. No more knocks, no more notes, just silence. I started to wonder if I was going crazy. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of work and life had finally gotten to me and my brain was playing tricks on me. But then exactly 1 week after the first incident, it happened again. I was in bed reading a book this time when I heard it knock, knock, knock. The same rhythm, the same intensity. My heart started racing as I sat up in bed straining to listen. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the building settling or someone dropping something in the hallway. But then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time I was ready. I grabbed my phone and turned on the video recording function. I wanted proof of what was happening. I crept to the door as quietly as possible and looked through the peephole. Once again, the hallway was empty, but this time I noticed something I'd missed before. The fluorescent light in the hallway was flickering more than usual, casting strange shadows on the walls. And there, on the carpet right in front of my door, was what looked like a wet footprint. I watched through the peephole for several minutes, recording everything. The footprint was definitely there and it was fresh. Someone had been standing at my door just moments before, someone with wet shoes. But where had they gone? I waited until I was sure the hallway was clear, then I slowly opened my door. The footprint was still there, a perfect outline of a boot sole on the beige carpet. I took pictures of it with my phone, then looked up and down the hallway for any other signs of whoever had been there. That's when I noticed that the door to the stairwell at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. I'd lived in this building for 6 years, and that door was always closed. Always. It was a fire door, and it was designed to stay shut unless someone was actively using the stairs. I approached the door cautiously, my phone still recording. I pushed it open just enough to peer into the stairwell. The lights were motion activated, so they came on as soon as I opened the door. But the stairwell was empty and I couldn't hear any footsteps echoing from above or below. I went back to my apartment and found another note under my door. This time the message was longer. I've been watching you for weeks. I know your schedule. I know when you're home and when you're not. Soon we'll meet face to face. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't someone who had the wrong apartment. This was someone who had been stalking me, someone who knew my routine, someone who had been planning this. I called the police immediately. 2 officers showed up about 20 minutes later, and I showed them the notes, the photos of the footprint, and the video I'd recorded. They took everything seriously, which was a relief after the property management company had basically dismissed my concerns. One of the officers, a middle-aged woman named Detective Martinez, asked me if I had any idea who might be doing this. Ex-boyfriend, co-worker, anyone who might have a grudge against me. I told her I couldn't think of anyone. I'd been single for over a year, I got along well with my co-workers, and I'd never had any serious conflicts with neighbors or strangers. What about the fire escape? I asked her. Could someone be using that to get into the building? Detective Martinez nodded. That's actually a really good point. Let's go take a look. We went outside, and she examined the fire escape more carefully than I had. She pointed out that several of the windows on the 2nd and 3rd floors showed signs of being tampered with. Scratches around the locks, smudges on the glass, things that suggested someone had been trying to get in. This is more serious than I initially thought, she said. Someone has definitely been casing this building. They know the camera positions, they know the building layout, and they've been planning this for a while. She arranged for extra patrol cars to drive by the building for the next few weeks, and she gave me her direct phone number in case anything else happened. But she also recommended that I consider staying somewhere else for a while, just until they could figure out who was doing this. I ended up staying at my sister's house for 2 weeks. During that time, Detective Martinez called me with an update that made my blood run cold. They'd installed additional security cameras in the building, including one pointed at the fire escape. 3 days after I'd left, they caught someone on video. It was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap. He climbed the fire escape to the 3rd floor and spent several minutes examining the windows near my apartment. He never tried to break in, but he was clearly looking for a way to get inside. The most disturbing part was what happened next. The man climbed back down the fire escape, walked around to the front of the building, and stood on the sidewalk looking up at my apartment window. He stood there for almost an hour just watching. Then he pulled out a notebook and wrote something down before walking away. They never caught him. Despite having his image on camera, despite increasing patrols, despite everything they tried, he just disappeared. Detective Martinez told me that this type of stalking behavior often escalates, and that I should consider moving for my own safety. I took her advice. I broke my lease, packed up my stuff, and moved to a different part of the city. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted from me. But I know that if I hadn't answered that first midnight knock, if I hadn't been curious enough to investigate, things could have ended very differently. The scariest part isn't what happened, it's what could have happened. This person had been planning something for weeks, maybe months. They knew my schedule, they knew the building layout, they had figured out how to avoid the security cameras. If they'd wanted to hurt me, they probably could have. I still think about those knocks sometimes. Knock, knock, knock. 3 simple sounds that changed everything. And I wonder if you heard that same knock at your door in the middle of the night. Would you be brave enough to answer it, or smart enough not to?